Arthur Pendleton lived in a very big, very quiet house. He was a man who had spent his whole life building things. He built a business from nothing, turning a simple idea into a giant company. He made a fortune, enough money to last several lifetimes. And with that money, he built this house, a beautiful, sprawling mansion with tall windows, shiny marble floors, and rooms so large your footsteps made an echo. It was meant to be a home, a place filled with laughter and life. But now, a year after his son was gone, the house felt like a museum. A very clean, very expensive, and very sad museum. The person who kept it so clean was a woman named Maria. She had worked for the family for 15 years. She was a quiet, kind woman who moved through the huge rooms like a ghost, dusting the furniture, polishing the silver picture frames, and trying her best not to disturb the heavy silence that had settled over everything. She knew the family's rhythms, their unspoken sadness. She saw how Arthur's wife, Eleanor, seemed to float through the days, her eyes always a little red, her smile a fragile thing that rarely appeared. She saw how Arthur himself had buried his grief under a mountain of work, coming home late, his face tired and closed off. Arthur missed his son Liam every single day. The boy had been his whole world. The quiet in the house wasn't peaceful. It was a constant reminder of the noise that was missing, the sound of Liam's music from his room, the slam of the front door when he came home from college, the lively debates they used to have at the dinner table. Now dinner was often a silent affair, or Arthur ate alone in his study, the clink of his fork sounding terribly loud in the quiet room. One afternoon, the sky turned a deep, gloomy gray. Thick clouds rolled in, and soon a steady, cold rain began to fall, tapping against the large windows of Arthur's home office. He had just returned from a meeting. It had been successful, as his meetings usually were. A new deal was signed. More money was going to come in. But sitting in his leather chair, staring out at the weeping sky, he felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction. Just a hollow emptiness. The money, the success. It all felt like piles of dry leaves, meaningless and easily blown away by the wind. Without really thinking about it, he stood up. He told his assistant he was going out and drove his expensive car through the slick, rain-washed streets. He wasn't heading to another meeting. He was driving towards the cemetery. He usually avoided the place. The raw, open grief he felt there was too much for him to handle. He preferred the controlled, quiet sadness of his home. But today the pull was too strong. He needed to be near his son. The cemetery was peaceful and sad under the rain. The green grass looked brighter and the gray headstones looked darker. He parked his car and walked along the familiar path, his expensive shoes getting wet and muddy. He could see Liam's gravestone from a distance, a beautiful, simple piece of gray marble. But as he got closer, he saw that he wasn't alone. A young girl was kneeling in front of the grave. Her back was to him and her head was bowed. She was getting soaked, her clothes clinging to her, but she wasn't moving. Arthur stopped, confused. Who was this? He moved a little closer and then he heard it, the sound of quiet, heartbroken sobbing. Her shoulders were shaking. He recognized her. It was Maria's daughter, Elena. She was 16, maybe 17. He saw her sometimes when she came to help her mother during school holidays. She was a quiet girl who always had her nose in a book. Why in the world was she here crying at his son's grave? A strange, uncomfortable feeling rose in his chest. It was a mix of surprise and a sudden, sharp sense of intrusion. This was his private place of grief. This was his son. What right did she have to be here, crying like her own heart was breaking? He took another step and a twig snapped under his foot. The girl heard it and jumped up, spinning around. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and red from crying. Rain and tears streamed down her cheeks. Mr. Pendleton, she stammered, wiping her face frantically with her hands. I'm so sorry. I'll go. I'm so sorry. She looked terrified, as if she had been caught stealing. She started to hurry away, her head down against the rain. But Arthur, looking at her tear-streaked face, didn't feel angry anymore. He just felt a deep, overwhelming curiosity, and a touch of the kindness he used to have before his world turned gray. Elena, wait, he said, his voice softer than he had used in a long time. It's all right. You don't have to run away. She stopped but didn't look at him, hugging her arms around herself. Arthur walked closer until he was standing beside her, both of them getting wet in the quiet cemetery. He looked from her frightened face to the name carved on his son's gravestone. Did you know Liam? He asked gently. Elena nodded, still looking at the ground. A little, she whispered, her voice shaky. From the library. We talk sometimes. The library? Arthur asked. He knew his son was a smart boy, but he couldn't picture him spending much time in a public library when he had a massive one at home. Yes, she said, finally looking up at him for a second. Her eyes were full of a pain that seemed too old for her young face. He was very kind. And with that, she turned and almost ran down the path, disappearing between the rows of headstones, leaving Arthur alone in the rain with a mystery he had never known existed. The library? His son? Kind? He stood there for a long time, the cold rain seeping into his coat, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't even know he was holding. The quiet, well-ordered world of his grief had just been cracked open, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt a need to understand. The rain kept falling all the way home. Arthur sat in his car, the only sound the swish of the windshield wipers and the quiet hum of the engine. He replayed the scene at the cemetery over and over in his mind. The girl, Elena, kneeling in the wet grass. The raw sound of her crying. The way she had looked at him, her eyes full of a pain that was deep and real. He was very kind. Those 3 simple words echoed in his head. They were not the words people usually used about his son. At the funeral, people had said Liam was brilliant, driven, a natural leader just like his father. They talked about his potential, the future CEO of the company. But kind? It was a small, soft word. It didn't seem to fit the ambitious young man Arthur thought he knew. He pulled into the long, winding driveway of his mansion. The house looked the same as always, grand, imposing, and silent. But it felt different now. The silence felt less like grief and more like a secret. What didn't he know about his own son? He walked inside, hanging his wet coat by the door. He could hear the soft, familiar sounds of Maria cleaning in the kitchen. For a moment, he thought about asking her, "Did your daughter know Liam? How? Why was she crying at his grave?" But he stopped himself. He saw the careful, respectful way Maria moved around the house, always giving him and his wife space with their sadness. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want her to think Elena was in trouble. This felt too private, too fragile for a simple question. Instead, he found himself walking towards a part of the house he almost never visited anymore, the library. It was a beautiful room, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves made of dark, rich wood. A large, ornate globe stood in one corner and a heavy leather sofa sat in the middle. But it was a room without life. The books were expensive leather-bound classics chosen by a decorator, not by a reader. There was no mess, no stack of books on the table, no jacket thrown over a chair. It was a perfect picture, just like the rest of the house. Arthur stood in the doorway looking around. "The library," she had said. "We talked at the library." Did she mean this one? It didn't make sense. Why would Liam and a housekeeper's daughter be talking in this formal, unused room? He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves. Everything was neat, perfectly in order. And then his eyes stopped on one shelf higher up. There was a gap, a single small gap between 2 thick, matching green books. It was a tiny thing, something he would never have noticed before. But now his mind was looking for clues, for anything out of place. He walked over and reached up. His fingers brushed against the spines of the books. In the dark space behind the gap, he felt something. Not the hard back of the shelf, but something else. Something soft like leather. His heart beat a little faster. He carefully hooked his finger and pulled. It was a small black leather-bound notebook. It wasn't one of his. It was slim, worn, and looked like it had been used often. It had been tucked away, hidden behind the grand books on the shelf. With a feeling that was both nervous and excited, Arthur sat down on the leather sofa. He held the book in his hands for a long moment, just looking at it. He had a feeling that whatever was inside was important, that it held answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask. Slowly, he opened it. The first page had his son's name, written in the familiar handwriting he knew so well. It was Liam's journal. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He felt like he was intruding, spying on his son's most private thoughts. But the need to understand, to somehow get closer to the boy he had lost, was too strong. He began to read. The early entries were what you might expect from a young man, thoughts about college, about friends, about the future. But as he turned the pages, a different picture of his son began to emerge. It was a picture Arthur had never seen. Liam wrote about feeling like he was living in a golden cage. He wrote about the heavy weight of his father's expectations. Dad talks about the company like it's my destiny, one entry said. But when I look at those spreadsheets, I don't see a destiny. I just see numbers. I don't think he's ever asked me what I really want. Arthur felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had been so proud, so sure that Liam would follow in his footsteps. He had never stopped to consider if that was what Liam wanted. He kept reading. And then he saw her name. Elena. Met a girl at the public library today, one entry began. Her name is Elena. She was sitting at my usual table, surrounded by school books. She looked frustrated with a math problem. I offered to help. She's sharp. Really sharp. We talked for an hour. It was the most real conversation I've had in months. Arthur looked up from the page, his eyes wide. The public library. Not this one. So that's what she meant. They had a secret meeting place away from this big, quiet house. He read more. Page after page, the story unfolded. Liam and Elena had formed a friendship. He would help her with her calculus and physics. In return, she would talk to him about her life, her family, her neighborhood, her dreams of becoming a nurse. She lent him books, not business books, but novels and poetry, and they would talk about them for hours. Liam's writing changed when he wrote about her. The tone became lighter, more hopeful. With Elena, I don't have to be Arthur Pendleton's son. I can just be Liam. She doesn't care about the money or the company. She sees me. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so busy building an empire for his son, he had forgotten to see the person his son was becoming. He turned to the last entry in the journal. The date sent a chill down his spine. It was the day Liam died. The handwriting was a little rushed but firm, determined. I can't live this double life anymore. I'm not going to business school. I've decided I want to study social work. I want to help people, the way Elena talks about helping people in her community. I know Dad will be disappointed. I know he'll think I'm throwing my future away, but it's my future, not his. I'm telling him everything tonight. About my plans, about Elena. I'm tired of living his dream. I have to live my own. Arthur closed the journal, his hands trembling. He sat in the silent, formal library, but he was no longer in that room. He was in the past, on the worst night of his life, but seeing it with completely new eyes. The car accident. Liam had been driving. The police said he was on the road that led away from the wealthy side of town, toward the neighborhood where Maria and Elena lived. Arthur had always assumed he was going to a friend's house, maybe a party. He never asked for details. The pain was too great. Now he knew the truth. His son hadn't been going to a party. He was on his way to see Elena. He was going to her, full of courage and hope, ready to start his real life. He was coming from this house, from a conversation he was going to have with his father. A conversation that never happened. Arthur put his head in his hands. The grief that washed over him was new and different. It wasn't just the pain of losing a son. It was the pain of realizing he never truly knew him, and the shocking, heartbreaking understanding of why a housekeeper's daughter was crying at his grave. She wasn't just mourning a friend. She was mourning a shared secret, a future that was stolen from them, and a love that his son was brave enough to choose. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, each sound like a small hammer in the quiet house. Arthur sat on the library sofa for a long time, the small black journal resting in his hands. He felt like the world had been tilted on its side, and everything he thought was solid and true had slid away. He had spent the last year mourning the son he thought he lost. The brilliant future CEO, the boy who would carry on the family name and business. But that boy, he now understood, was mostly a story he had told himself. The real Liam, the one in these pages, was someone entirely different. He was thoughtful, he was kind, and he felt trapped. He had a secret life, a secret friend, and a secret dream that his own father knew nothing about. A heavy feeling of shame mixed with his grief. How could he have been so blind? How could he have talked so much about the company, about legacy, about the future, without ever once asking his son what made him happy? He remembered the last dinner they had together. He had spent most of it talking about a new business deal. Liam had been quiet, nodding along. Arthur thought he was being respectful. Now he realized his son was probably just hiding his true feelings, gathering the courage to tell the truth. He thought about his wife, Eleanor. She was upstairs, probably lost in her own silent sorrow. Did she know any of this? Had Liam confided in her? He doubted it. She was just as caught up in the life they had built, the image they had to maintain. They were both living in the same beautiful prison, and they had unknowingly locked their son in with them. He stood up, his body feeling stiff and old. He walked out of the library and climbed the grand staircase. He paused outside his wife's bedroom door. He hadn't knocked on this door in a long time. They had started sleeping in separate rooms a few months after Liam died, the shared bed too painful a reminder of the family they once were. He raised his hand and knocked softly. "Come in." Her voice was faint. He opened the door. She was sitting by the window looking out at the rain, a book lying unopened in her lap. She turned and her eyes were surprised to see him. "Arthur, is everything all right?" He didn't know how to say it. He just walked over and held out the journal. "I found this," he said, his voice rough. "In the library. It's Liam's." Her eyes widened, filling with a fresh wave of pain. She took the book as if it were a holy object. She opened it and began to read. Arthur sat on the edge of a nearby chair, watching her face. He saw the same journey of emotions he had just gone through. The confusion, the dawning realization, and finally the heartbreaking understanding. Her hand flew to her mouth and a soft, choked sob escaped her lips. "He was in love," she whispered, her voice trembling. Arthur nodded, his own eyes stinging. He was going to tell us that night. He was on his way to see her when he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. For the first time in a year, they weren't just two people sharing a house and a loss. They were a mother and a father, united by a shocking and beautiful truth about their child. Eleanor cried, not just the quiet tears she usually shed, but deep, shaking sobs. Arthur went to her, kneeling beside her chair, and put his arm around her. They held each other, crying for the son they had lost and for the son they were only now meeting for the very first time. Later, when the storm of tears had passed, they talked. They talked for hours, sitting together in her room as the afternoon light faded. They shared memories of Liam, little things that now made so much more sense. The time he had volunteered at a homeless shelter and talked about it for weeks. The way he always asked Maria about her family. They had seen these things as small acts of charity, signs of a good heart. They never saw them as clues to his true passion, to the life he desperately wanted to build. "We never really saw him, did we?" Eleanor said, her voice heavy with regret. Arthur shook his head. "We saw what we wanted to see. We saw our legacy. He just wanted to be a person." The next day, Arthur knew what he had to do. He had to talk to Elena. He needed to hear it from her. He needed to understand the full picture of his son's secret life. He waited until he knew she would be home from school. He didn't call or send a formal message. He simply asked Maria if he could speak with her daughter for a moment. He saw the flicker of worry in Maria's eyes. "Of course, Mr. Pendleton, is everything okay?" "It's okay, Maria," he said, trying to sound reassuring. I need to ask her about Liam." Maria looked confused, but she nodded and went to get her daughter. A few minutes later, Arthur was in his study. It was a room designed to impress and intimidate, with a huge dark wood desk and walls lined with awards and diplomas. He was standing by the window when the door opened softly. Elena walked in. She looked small and frightened, like a bird ready to fly away. She kept her eyes on the floor. "Please sit down," Arthur said, his voice gentle. She sat on the very edge of the large leather chair in front of his desk, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The silence in the room was thick and uncomfortable. Arthur didn't sit behind his big desk. Instead, he pulled up a smaller chair and sat near her. He placed the black journal on the small table between them. Elena's eyes darted to it, and her face went pale. She looked like she was about to be sick. "I found it," Arthur said softly. "I read it." A single tear rolled down her cheek. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We didn't mean to. We were just..." Arthur shook his head. "You don't have to apologize. Not at all." He took a deep breath. "He loved you, didn't he?" The question hung in the air. Elena looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for anger, for judgment. When she saw only a deep, sad curiosity, her composure broke. She nodded, fresh tears falling freely now. "Yes," she said, her voice a little stronger. "And I loved him. Hearing the words out loud was like a physical blow to Arthur's heart, but it also felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a door to the truth. He was the best person I ever knew, she continued, her words coming out in a rush now. He was so smart, but he never made me feel stupid. He was so kind. He helped me with my homework. He listened to me. He made me feel important. Arthur listened, his own eyes wet. This was the son from the journal, brought to life in her words. He was so scared to tell you, she said, looking down at her hands. He wanted you to be proud of him. But he said he couldn't breathe sometimes. He said he felt like he was wearing a costume. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, the truth of her words cutting deep. The night Elena's voice cracked. He was so happy. He had finally made his decision. He was going to tell you everything. About wanting to be a social worker, about us. He was so brave. She took a shaky breath. He was coming to my house first. He said he had something to give me. For good luck, before he talked to you. She reached into the small backpack she had brought with her. Her hands were trembling. She pulled out a small square box, wrapped in dark blue velvet. It was a little worn, like it had been held many times. She placed it carefully on top of the journal. He was bringing me this. The small velvet box sat on the table between them. It was a dark, deep blue, the color of the night sky. In the quiet, formal study, it seemed to hold all the sound and light in the room. Arthur could not take his eyes off of it. He looked from the box to Elena's face. She was watching him, her eyes wide and full of a fresh young grief. She gave a small, hesitant nod, as if giving him permission. With a hand that felt strangely numb, Arthur reached out. His fingers, which had signed million-dollar contracts, now trembled as they touched the soft fabric of the box. It was so small, so light. He picked it up. The hinge was tight. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of white silk, was a locket. It was simple and beautiful, made of silver that shone even in the soft light of the room. It wasn't a flashy, expensive piece of jewelry. It was the kind of gift that showed deep thought, that showed you knew the person you were giving it to. Arthur carefully lifted it from the box. It felt cool against his skin. He found the tiny clasp and opened it. The inside was empty. There was no picture. But there was an inscription. 2 words engraved in a graceful, looping script. My beginning. He read the words once, then again, and then their meaning washed over him like a wave. This wasn't just a gift. This was a promise. This was his son, on the most important night of his young life, declaring that his real life, his true life, was just starting. And it was starting with this girl, this kind, smart girl from a different world who saw the real person hiding inside the millionaire's son. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He leaned back in his chair, the locket held tightly in his palm. He looked at Elena, truly looked at her. He saw no greed in her eyes, no calculation. He only saw a reflection of his own pain, and a love that had been cut short. So this is why, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This is why you were at the grave. Elena nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I go sometimes, she admitted. To talk to him, to tell him about my day. It's the only place I feel close to him. She looked at the locket in his hand. He never got to give it to me. The police. They found it in his car. They gave it to my mother a few days later to give to me. They thought it was just something he had bought for a friend. She had been carrying this secret, this pain, all by herself for a whole year. While he and his wife were surrounded by their public grief in their big, quiet house, this young girl was holding her heartbreak alone, with only a locket that never reached her. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The shock wasn't a bad shock, it wasn't a scandal. It was the shocking, beautiful truth of his son's character. Liam wasn't the person Arthur thought he was. He was better. He was braver. He had followed his heart, even when it was the most difficult path to take. In that moment, Arthur's grief changed shape. For a year, it had been a heavy, dark stone sitting in his chest. Now it cracked open. and from inside, something new began to grow. It was a feeling of purpose, a need to make things right. Not to fix the past, that was impossible, but to honor the son he had finally met. He gently placed the locket back into its box and held it out to Elena. "This belongs to you," he said. She looked surprised, then touched. She took the box and held it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Arthur said, and he meant it with his whole heart. "Thank you for loving my son, and thank you for being his friend when he felt so alone." He stood up. Would you and your mother like to have dinner with us? With me and my wife, I think. I think we have a lot to talk about." Elena looked shocked, but then a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first time Arthur had ever seen her smile. "I would like that," she said. "I'll ask my mother." That evening, the dining room in the big, quiet house felt different. The long, polished table was set for 4. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a nervous, hopeful energy. When Elena and her mother arrived, Maria looked anxious, unsure of why she was being asked to sit at the family's table. But Arthur and his wife, Eleanor, greeted them with a warmth that was new. Eleanor's eyes were still sad, but they were also soft as she looked at Elena. She took the girl's hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you for coming," she said. The dinner was quiet at first. The clinking of silverware was loud in the room. But then, Arthur began to speak. He told Maria what he had discovered. He told her about the journal, about the library, about the locket. He apologized for not knowing, for the secret her daughter had to carry. Maria listened, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at her daughter, not with anger, but with a mother's understanding of a hidden pain. Then, Elena began to speak. She told them stories Arthur had never heard. She talked about the Liam who loved a specific kind of cheap pizza from a corner shop. She talked about the Liam who got so excited about a poem he read that he called her in the middle of the night to read it to her. She talked about his dream to build community centers for kids who had nowhere to go after school. As she spoke, Liam came alive in the room, not as a memory of a sad, lost boy, but as a vibrant, funny, and passionate young man. Arthur and his wife laughed through their tears. They were finally getting to know their son. For the first time since the tragedy, the big house didn't feel like a museum. It felt like it had a heartbeat again. It was the heartbeat of a shared story, a painful but beautiful truth that was finally being told. Arthur looked around the table, at his wife who was actually talking and listening, at Maria, who was now a part of their story, and at Elena, who held a piece of their son's soul. He knew then that his work wasn't finished. He had spent his life building a company. Now he had to build something else, something that would truly honor the son he had lost, something that would make the words "my beginning" mean something for other people too. The dinner had ended, but the feeling in the house had changed. It was as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for a year, letting in fresh air and a little bit of light. Arthur stood at his study window, watching Elena and her mother walk to their car. His wife, Eleanor, had gone upstairs, but she had hugged him goodnight. A real hug, not just a polite gesture. It was a start. For the next few weeks, Arthur couldn't stop thinking. The heavy, numb feeling was gone, replaced by a restless energy. He would sit in his son's room, not to be sad, but to feel close to the person he was now getting to know. He looked at the books on the shelf and realized many of them were poetry and stories about social justice, not the business books he had always given him. He saw the world through a new lens, and it was both painful and inspiring. He knew he couldn't bring his son back. That pain would always be there. But he could do something to honor the real Liam, the boy who wanted to help people, the boy who found his beginning in a simple, honest love. One morning, he called a meeting with his lawyers and his most trusted business advisors. They sat around the large table in his company's boardroom, expecting to talk about profits and expansion. Instead, Arthur began to speak from his heart. He told them about his son, not the public story but the private truth. He told them about the journal, the locket, and the dream Liam had to be a social worker. He saw the surprise on their faces. This was not the Arthur Pendleton they knew. "I've spent my life building this company," Arthur said, his voice firm. "And it's been successful. But I realized something. I was building a legacy for a son who didn't want it. He wanted a different kind of legacy, a legacy of compassion." He laid out his plan. He was going to use a very large part of his personal fortune to start a foundation. He called it the New Beginning Foundation. The purpose was simple: to help young people. It would provide full scholarships for students who wanted to study social work, nursing, and teaching, the professions that help communities thrive. It would also fund and build youth centers in neighborhoods that didn't have them, places where kids could go after school to be safe, to learn, and to be heard. Places like the one Liam had dreamed of. His advisors were shocked. This was not a typical business investment. There was no profit to be made. But they saw the fire in Arthur's eyes, a passion they hadn't seen in years. They agreed to help him make it happen. The next step was the most important one. He invited Elena and her mother to his office. When they arrived, he could see they were nervous. He smiled to put them at ease. "Elena," he began, "you knew a part of my son that I never did. You understood his heart. This foundation, it's for him, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." He explained his vision for the New Beginning Foundation. He told her about the scholarships in the youth centers. "I want you to be a youth advisor on the board," he said. "You are young. You are from the community he wanted to help. You can tell us what these kids really need. You can make sure we get it right. Your voice." It will be his voice. Elena was speechless. She looked from Arthur to her mother, her eyes wide. She was just a teenager, but she saw the sincerity in his face. He wasn't just giving charity. He was asking for her partnership. I would be honored," she said, her voice full of emotion. With Elena's guidance, the foundation took shape quickly. They found an old, unused community hall in a part of the city that Arthur had never even visited. He didn't just write a check. He went there himself. He put on old clothes and helped with the cleaning and the painting. He talked to the kids who hung around outside, asking them what they wanted. A basketball court? A computer lab? A quiet place to study? The news of the Millionaire building a youth center spread. At first, people were suspicious. They thought it was a publicity stunt. But when they saw Arthur coming back day after day, getting his hands dirty, and when they saw Elena by his side explaining things to him, their suspicion turned into curiosity, and then into support. The grand opening of the first New Beginning Youth Center was a bright, sunny day. The building, once old and gray, was now painted in bright, cheerful colors. There was a new basketball hoop outside and the sound of laughter coming from inside. Arthur stood at the front, ready to give a speech. He looked out at the crowd. There were community leaders, reporters, and many, many families with their children. His wife, Eleanor, stood beside him, her hand in his, a real smile on her face. Maria and Elena stood close by, beaming with pride. He looked at the faces of the children full of hope and excitement. He didn't see his speech notes. He decided to speak from his heart. "A year ago," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I thought I had lost everything. I thought I had lost my son. But I was wrong. I just hadn't found him yet." He told the story simply. He spoke of a boy who felt trapped, a boy who found kindness in a library, and a boy who was brave enough to choose his own path. "This center is not a memorial," Arthur said, his eyes finding Elena's in the crowd. "It is a promise to listen to our young people, a promise to help them find their own beginning. My son taught me that the greatest legacy is not what you build for yourself, but the hope you help build in others." He cut the ribbon. The children rushed inside. Arthur stood back and watched them. The sound of their laughter and bouncing balls filled the air. It was the opposite of the silence in his big, quiet house. This was the sound of life. This was the sound of new beginnings. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Elena. "He would be so proud of you," she said softly. Arthur looked at her, then at the vibrant center, and finally at his wife, who was talking and laughing with Maria. "No," he said, putting his arm around Elena's shoulders. "He would be proud of us." The house was still big, but it was no longer quiet or sad. It was now the headquarters of the foundation, a place filled with plans and purpose. The grief for the son he lost would always be a part of him, but it was now wrapped in the love for the son he had found. And in helping other children find their way, Arthur Pendleton had finally found his own new beginning.